Thank you so much. This has been such a fun week to be on Heartstrong. I was saying to the ladies before you all came on, I don't often get to join live because of kids and schedules and buses, and my dogs are loud and annoying and all the things. But um, I was able to come live every day this week, and it's been so good. This is just some of the things that have come over the last 5 years. Like it's been a really like roller coaster 5 years for a lot of people in a lot of ways, but some of the things that have started, like God's moving so clearly in them, and it's so cool that things are prevailing and still happening, and that we would hold on to the things that are God given from this season. Because one day we will look back at the early 2020 years and and some really cool things. I hope that we'll have some good memories out of them. And I think Heartstrong's one of them for many of you probably. So okay, before I talk about nothing for half an hour, let's talk about something. So we are in First Samuel today, chapters 13 and 14. So we left off, and Saul is king. And his first move here, he's appointing his son Jonathan to lead a campaign against the Philistines. So let's jump in at chapter 13, verse 2. Saul chose 3,000 men from Israel. 2,000 men were with him at Michmash in the hill country of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah in Benjamin. The rest of the men he sent back to their homes. So the long and short here is that they've basically divided into two campaigns. And Jonathan's campaign is successful. We'll come to know a lot about Jonathan's character in this, but one of the incredible things about him is he's like a wonderful leader and obviously wonderful in battle. So meanwhile, let's go back to verse 5. The Philistines assembled to fight Israel with 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. So that's super intimidating right there, obviously. They went up and camped at Michmash, east of Beth Aven. When the Israelites saw that their situation was critical and that their army was hard pressed, they hid in caves and thickets, among the rocks, and in pits and cisterns. Some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. So the Hebrews are looking at the army. They're incredibly intimidated, and they're like, we got to hide. Forget this. We're not going to battle. We're going to hide. Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops with him were quaking with fear. So Saul has released Jonathan to go complete his war campaign, but meanwhile, he's been asked by Samuel to wait. So he's been told to wait, to not engage yet. So he remains at Gilgal. He waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. So if I'm Saul in this moment, I'm terrified. The people are looking to me as a leader, and they're losing confidence in my leadership. They're starting to scatter. They're hiding. They're literally hiding behind like boulders and rocks and all over the place. So I'm starting to question my ability as a leader if I'm Saul, and I'm starting to panic, and I'm starting to get really nervous. And so Saul does something that I think, if I'm being honest, I might have put myself in that same position too, where I start panicking and thinking, okay, maybe I wasn't supposed to wait. Maybe something's wrong. Maybe I need to take things into my own hands. Oof, which is like the worst human thing that we always try to do, right? We try to take something that we've been told by God, and we take it into our own hands. Okay, so he's been told to wait for 7 days. Samuel has not shown up. He's panicking. So Saul does this. Verse 9, he said, bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings. And Saul offered up the burnt offering. Just as he finished making the offering, oh, look who arrives. It's Samuel. And he comes right on in. Samuel is not impressed. He says, what have you done? Saul replied, when I saw the men scattering and that you did not come at the set time and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favor. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering. So Saul completely takes things into his own hands, starts making offerings that he should not have been doing. He should have waited for Samuel. This moment here of Saul doing this actually sets something in motion that affects his entire life, as we'll see next. He felt compelled to offer the burnt offering. So this escalates. Samuel responds here. He says, "You have done a foolish thing. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command." Oof. So we'll dig into that a little bit here. God sees something in Saul. He allows him to be appointed king, but Saul's character flaws keep coming to the forefront, and they are so destructive. They're actually, it's so tragic. His character is causing his downfall here. He's extremely concerned about people's perception about him. When he's trying to lead and his people are hiding or his people are scattering, and he's thinking, what are they saying about me? They're probably, wondering, like, what kind of leader is this? Like, why are we waiting? What is going on? He takes matters into his own hands. He goes against what he's been told and what God has directed. He sees he's losing the favor of the people, and he neglects his faithfulness to God. Verse 14, "You're foolish." This is a strong phrase. He didn't mean like, oh, you're silly or you're like unintelligent. The Bible speaks of a fool as someone who could be like morally or spiritually lacking. You've not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. Saul is sometimes full of excuses, all the reasons, the blaming of someone else, but still the bottom line with God is the bottom line. He had not kept the commandment of the Lord your God. He did the opposite of what God had commanded. Now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. The whole point of being a king was, and still I think some probably is to establish a dynasty, where your children sit on the throne after you. God told Saul that his descendants would not reign after him. Though he's a king, he would not establish the monarchy. Now your kingdom shall not continue. Saul continues to reign, but that one choice, allowing his character to shine through like that, it's his downfall. Refusing to wait, refusing to be obedient, rushing God's timing can have lifelong consequences. Oof. That story, I was reading that and I was like, oh man, like the conviction. Because yeah, I'm not leading an army, but I am for sure guilty in my character as well of trying to rush God's timing. So this is actually our first discussion question of today. And it's this: rushing God's timing can have consequences. Have you ever experienced this? Or on the flip side, how has abiding by God's timing been a blessing to you? I would love to hear some of that when we have our discussion time. Okay, so a quick final note about this chapter that's actually super cool, and you could do a whole sermon on just this little part here. But it's verse 16, Israel without weapons. So Saul and his son Jonathan and the men with them were staying in Gibeah and Benjamin, while the Philistines camped at Michmash. Raiding parties went out from the Philistine camp in 3 detachments. One turned towards, and Mitch and I have been arguing about how to pronounce this word, but Ophrah? I'm going to go with Ophrah. Feels right for today. In the vicinity of Shual, another towards Beth-horon, and the third towards the borderland overlooking the valley of Zeboim facing the wilderness. Okay, so listen to this. Verse 19, not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel, because the Philistines had said, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears. So this just makes like strategic war sense. The Philistines had superior military technology, and they wanted to keep it that way, which if you're in a battle, like, yeah, that makes sense, right? You take away all the blacksmiths, and suddenly the Hebrews have no one to forge weapons for them. So the Philistines were able to import weapons and obviously had blacksmiths to sharpen them. And so they were like far advanced in the military. Okay, so let's keep going. All of Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plow points, mattocks, axes, and sickles sharpened. So Israel's literally, they have no blacksmiths. They're going down to the Philistines to have their farm tools sharpened because they don't have any great weapons. So they're paying the Philistines to sharpen their weapons so that they can go and battle each other. And they're charging them for this. So on the day of the battle, not a soldier with Saul and Jonathan had a sword or spear in his hand. Only Saul and his son Jonathan had them. This is wild. And this is so cool. let me tell you this. God is not nothing if he's not fighting our battles for us, because we have example and example again in the scriptures of God taking something that should not be, taking an army that is not prepared, that is fighting with, like, farm tools against armies that have all the military technology in the world. And if God says it will prevail, it will prevail. This is something that we today should take such confidence in and be able to turn back to again and again to say, like, okay, even if I'm showing up to, you ever heard the expression, like showing up to a gunfight with a knife or something like that, where you're not matched at all. Sometimes that's us, right? Sometimes that is us. And God, if God goes with us, nothing can stand against. It's just not how God works. If he declares it for us, if he declares that victory, we can stand strong in it. Okay, so question 2. And I'm also really hoping that this one will speak to someone too. Question 2, have you ever gone into a situation or a battle or whatever it may be, probably not a war scenario, but for us, spiritual warfare, of course. Have you ever gone into a situation feeling completely unprepared, but you knew that God would show up? So please, if that's happened to you, share with us later. Encourage us, because these kind of stories are wild and I love hearing them. It just confirms the greatness and the goodness of God, and that if he is for us, nothing can stand against. Okay, so chapter 13, let's get into chapter 14 now, because this is awesome. Okay. One day, Jonathan, son of Saul, said to his young armor-bearer, "Come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side." But he did not tell his father. So these two, they kind of sneak away from camp, not sneak, but they decide to leave camp. And Saul does not know that this is happening. Saul was staying on the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree in Migron. With him were about 600 men, among whom was Ahijah, who was wearing an ephod, so like a ceremonial priestly garment. He was a son of Ichabod's brother, Ahitub, son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest in Shiloh. And no one was aware that Jonathan and his armor bearer had left. Okay. On each side of the pass that Jonathan intended to cross to reach the Philistine outpost was a cliff. One was called Bozez and the other Seneh. One cliff stood north towards Michmash, the other south towards Geba. Jonathan said to his young armor bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf." Listen to this. This is so, so good. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. So Jonathan here is secure. He's secure in what God says. He's secure in trusting what God will do. Okay, listen how the armor bearer responds to this. "Do all that you have in mind. Go ahead. I'm with you, heart and soul." So we've got to stop here, like full stop, and talk about this armor bearer. So armor bearers were chosen usually based on like their loyalty to a warrior or to whoever they were serving, because to respond to someone who's saying like, "Hey, there's just the two of us. Let's kind of see what happens and trust God that we're going to be able to, win this battle or achieve this campaign." For an armor bearer to respond, "Go ahead. I'm with you, heart and soul." That's incredible. That person has to be prepared to die for this other person, right? To follow them even unto death. It's trust, it's loyalty, and it's faith that this person is leading well if you're following them. So I really had to pause here in preparation for teaching and kind of like examine these words from like a twofold perspective. So like, first of all, am I willing, are we all willing to do this with our own faith? So if we are following God, like if we're trusting God the way Jonathan does, are we willing to just say to God, regardless of the circumstances in front of us, "I'm with you, heart and soul. Like, let's go. I'm in. I'm right behind you. I've got your back." Like, are we willing to follow plans like that with just unbelievable trust and faith, even despite circumstances saying otherwise? And secondly, the second perspective of that, like, do we have people in our lives? Like, so do I have someone in my life that I'm willing to follow that way? Do I have people in my life that I'm willing to look at and saying like, hey, I trust the vision. I trust what God has said to you. I trust that I, even unto death, will be by your side. Do I have people that I would do that for? And do I have people that would do that for me? That's like a really, really deep, crazy thing to think about. To have that type of loyalty, that type of faith, that type of like fellowship and like deep, deep intimacy and trust with people. It's crazy. So, okay. So Jonathan says in this moment, nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by a few. And the armor bearer responds, do all that you have in mind. Go ahead, I am with you, heart and soul. Okay, this is our third question. Do we have armor bearers in our own lives? Do we have people that would stand with you like this? Or would you do this for others? Okay, back into the story. Verse 8, Jonathan said, come on then, we will cross over towards them and let them see us. If they say to us, wait until we come to you, we will stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say, come up to us, we will climb up, because that will be our sign the Lord has given them into our hands. So they've got a plan. They trust that God is going to give them clarity on what to do. So both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. Look, said the Philistines, the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes they were hiding in. The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor bearer. So Jonathan said to his armor bearer, climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel. Still, Jonathan sticks with the plan. He says, yep, it's a go. Let's do it. Jonathan climbed up using his hands and feet and his armor bearer right behind him. The Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer followed and killed behind him. In that first attack, Jonathan and his armor bearer killed some 20 men in an area of about half an acre. So clearly, Jonathan trusted in what God was telling him, trusted in the signs that God was going to give him, and he walked into victory with his armor bearer right behind him. God won that for them. Jonathan knew that that God would see him through. He had a deep and certain conviction that God would give him the right signs at the right time, and that if he was faithful, he would walk in victory and confidence. Okay, verse 15. Then panic struck the whole army, those in the camp and field and those in the outposts and raiding parties, and the ground shook. It was a panic sent by God. Saul's lookouts at Gibeah and Benjamin saw the army melting away in all directions. Then Saul said to the men who were with him, muster the forces and see who has left us. When they did, it was Jonathan and his armor bearer who were not there. So Saul is now realizing, oh, Jonathan and the armor bearer are missing. Saul said to Ahijah, bring the ark of God. At that time, it was with the Israelites. While Saul was talking to the priest, the tumult in the Philistine camp increased more and more. So Saul said to the priest, withdraw your hand. Then Saul and all his men assembled and went into battle. So Saul is trying to take advantage of this moment. The camp is in chaos, and he's like, let's go, let's go. They found the Philistines in total confusion, striking each other with their swords. Those Hebrews who had previously been with the Philistines and had gone up with them to their camp went over to the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. When all the Israelites who had hidden in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were on the run, they joined the battle in hot pursuit. So on that day, the Lord saved Israel, and the battle moved on beyond Bethaven. Okay, so Saul is still all wrapped up in victory, wanting to kind of do it his own way. You see, even in the way that he's, handling the preparation for this army. Okay, so let's see what happens next. Now the Israelites were in distress that day because Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying, cursed be anyone who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged on my enemies. So again, he's thinking about himself. He's saying, you know what, guys, no time for food. I don't care if you're starving or weak or whatever. We're going to battle because I need to avenge my enemies. So he's thinking selfishly. He's not thinking of his army. He's not caring for the people around him. He's panicking. So none of the troops tasted food. The entire army entered the woods, and there was honey on the ground. When they went into the woods, they saw the honey oozing out, yet no one put his hand to his mouth because they feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard that his father had bound the people with the oath. So he reached out the end of his staff that was in his hand and dipped it into the honeycomb. He raised his hand to his mouth, and his eyes brightened. Then one of the soldiers told him, uh-oh, it's like, dude, you're in trouble. Your father bound the army under a strict oath saying, cursed be anyone who eats food today. This is why the men are faint. So they're literally saying, like, your father has cursed us, but we're all in terrible shape. Like, we're fainting. We're not doing well here. Jonathan responds, my father has made trouble for the country. See how my eyes brightened when I tasted a little of this honey? So Jonathan is like, that seems like a bit of a foolish oath. Like, he's a little bit here saying, I don't really like dad's call on this one. He's not impressed with it. He's like, of course you need to eat. Like, look what's happening here. See how my eyes brightened? And then verse 30. How much better it would have been if the men had eaten today some of the plunder they took from their enemies. Would not the slaughter of the Philistines have been even greater? Verse 31. That day, after the Israelites had struck down the Philistines from Michmash to Ajalon, they were exhausted. They pounced on the plunder, taking sheep, cattle, and calves. They butchered them on the ground and ate them together with the blood. Then someone said to Saul, look, the men are sinning against the Lord by eating meat that has blood in it. You have broken faith, he said. Roll a large stone over here at once. So this is the result of like a panicked, starving army. They go and they plunder because they're in a panic, and they're butchering things, and they're not properly treating things. They're not draining the blood properly. So they're desecrating all of it because of Saul's oath that he had given to them not to eat. Now they're so hungry that they're going crazy with it. Okay. Verse 34. Then he said, go out among the men and tell them, each of you bring me your cattle and sheep and slaughter them here and eat them. Do not sin against the Lord by eating meat with blood still in it. So everyone brought his ox that night and slaughtered it there. Then Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first time he had done this. Saul said, let us go down and pursue the Philistines by night and plunder them till dawn. Let us not leave one of them alive. Again, he's panicking, and he's trying to fix it once again. They respond, do whatever is best for you, they replied. But the priest said, let us inquire of God here. So Saul asked God, shall I go down and pursue the Philistines? Will you give them into Israel's hands? But God did not answer him that day. Again, we see God trying to help Saul learn about timing and obedience. We see Saul's impatience, his eagerness to steamroll God's timing. Saul said, come here, all of you who are leaders of my army, and let us find out what sin has been committed today. As surely as the Lord who rescues Israel lives, even if the guilt lies in my son Jonathan, he must die. But no one said a word. So nobody of all the leaders wants to sell out Jonathan, even though Jonathan has broken the oath and eaten the honey. Saul then said to the Israelites, you stand over there, I and Jonathan, my son, will stand over here. Do what seems best to you, they replied. Then Saul prayed to the Lord, the God of Israel. Why have you not answered your servant today? Is it the fault of me or my son Jonathan? Respond with Urim. But if the men of Israel are at fault, respond with Thummim. So this is like kind of like casting lots. The priest kept items on their breastplate, and it would help them kind of like determine what God was wanting for them. Jonathan and Saul were taken by lot, and the men were cleared. So all the men have been determined innocent of breaking the oath. Then Saul said, cast the lot between me and Jonathan, my son. And Jonathan was taken. So in this moment, Saul realizes that Jonathan has broken the oath. Saul says to Jonathan, tell me what you have done. And Jonathan told him, I tasted a little honey with the end of my staff, and now I must die. Jonathan is loyal and honorable here even till death, even though he, as we see earlier, he kind of believes that was a foolish vow. Like, why would you not allow your army to sustain themselves? And Saul says, may God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you do not die, Jonathan. So Saul's willing to essentially sacrifice his son for his own pride here. But the men said to Saul, this is so good. Listen to this part. Okay, verse 45. But the men said to Saul, should Jonathan die, he who has brought about this great deliverance in Israel? Never. As surely as the Lord lives, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground, for he did this today with God's help. So the men, the army who'd already been cleared of like wrongdoing, who had not broken the oath, stepped in and said like, no, we are coming alongside to stand for Jonathan. We do not want him put to death for this. They recognize like his loyalty and what an honorable person he is, and how also God is with him. Okay, so then Saul stopped pursuing the Philistines, and they withdrew to their own land. So this is the right at the end of chapter 14 here. We see that Saul is ruling and fighting, and I like the last little part. He's just gathering up people to his army. Um, so final thoughts, because we are just out of time. I could just keep going and going and going, but final thoughts as we close. So where Saul made excuses for his behavior and tried to kind of steamroll and change and like intervene and offer his own sacrifices to kind of get what he wanted, Jonathan was actually prepared to answer for his behavior. He was prepared to even go to death to say, like, no, I did go against the vow, even though, like, yeah, it's a foolish vow, whatever. He was prepared to stand in integrity and say, like, I did this. Jonathan showed faith and trust in God in his battles. Saul had a lot of trouble acknowledging his own mistakes. And that's hard because, to be honest, like, sometimes I see a lot of myself in Saul. Like, it's so easy to get into situations where you see something happening and you're like, oh, I just need to intervene. If I just fix it, if I just do this, if I just like insert myself here, I can fix it. So anyways, it's something to kind of sit with and be convicted of a little bit myself, like, for sure. But I want to close with this because we're at 6:29, and I know there's some of you that head out at this time. But my prayer for us is that we would walk together, heart and soul. That we would walk together, following God, trusting His lead, but we would also have people come alongside us to shoulder things with us, that we would be able to walk closely enough with people in intimacy and fellowship, that we are able to say, I'm with you, heart and soul. So let me just pray for you before we get into our discussion time, and we'll release those who need to go. God, thank you that you never stop teaching. I pray that you would, God, just open our hearts continuously. God, keep searching our hearts for things in us that you need to figure out with us. God, help us to be humble, help us to be teachable, help us to be open, because God, we have never arrived. We have never learned everything that there is to know about your character, about your kindness, about your goodness. God, it's constantly, constantly just showering us and teaching us new things. Lord, I pray that you'd bless everyone who goes about their day today. Help them to feel your presence close to them, God. Help them to feel confident as they go into different battles, God, that you are with them, that you are directing them, God. Help us not to take matters into our own hands, even though it is incredibly difficult, God. Help us to take that difficulty to you, to surrender things to you. Thank you so much, God, for who you are and for everything that you do for us. We love you, God. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so if you need to leave, please be dismissed. We love you. Go about your awesome day. And I think I'll pass it back to Alonli, and she will open up the floor for questions. And I am looking forward to some fun conversation. Bless you all.